Hey there. So, you think you'd thrive in medieval Europe? Waking up in a cozy stone cottage, sipping warm ale by the hearth, maybe petting a goat or two before heading out to live your rustic dream life under castle shadows? Yeah, no. This world may look like the setting of a fairy tale. Cobblestone streets, noble quests, majestic cathedrals echoing with Gregorian chants. But it's not what you think, because behind the picturesque imagery of knights and courtly love was a daily grind that smelled like rot, sounded like moaning illness, and felt like cold mud in your boots. Literally, before you even open your eyes, you're lying on a straw mattress crawling with more life than you'd like to admit. It's freezing, not chilly, freezing, the kind of cold that clings to your bones because there's no insulation, no glass windows, and the fire went out hours ago. You sit up, inhale sharply, and immediately regret it. The air is a blend of wood smoke, body odor, livestock, and something sour you're hoping isn't dead. So, welcome to medieval Europe, land of kings, plagues, and the very real chance that this morning's bread might break your tooth before the day does. If you think a rough morning is the worst of it, buckle up, because surviving one day in medieval Europe wasn't about thriving. It was about not dying in increasingly creative, avoidable ways. See, every breath you take in this world is a gamble. The water, probably laced with animal waste, and the occasional decomposing something. The food, half rotten, overly salted, or just suspiciously gray. The medicine, leech based, prayer powered, and wildly ineffective, unless your illness is a bad attitude. If you're lucky, you'll spend your day doing back-breaking labor in the fields, hunched over in the rain, while your boots, if you have any, fill with mud and guilt. If you're unlucky, someone accuses you of witchcraft because your bread rose weird, and now your neighbors want you publicly dunked, burned, or worse. Here's the deal. If this time period hadn't been so absurdly harsh, we wouldn't have needed saints, charms, and 7 different kinds of plague cures made from garlic and goose fat. And if you think your modern immune system and gym membership give you an edge here, I've got news. This place will chew you up before the sun even sets. You survived the night. Congratulations. That's already more than some people manage. But the good news stops there. The first thing you feel isn't comfort. It's cold. A deep, bone-gnawing cold that wraps around you like a wet burlap sack. You're lying on a straw-stuffed mattress, if you're lucky. If not, it's a pile of reeds, or maybe just the dirt floor, with a blanket that smells like goat. The fire went out hours ago, and there's no insulation between you and the morning chill seeping through the stone walls. In fact, there are barely walls, cracks everywhere. You can feel the wind sliding its fingers under the door like it's trying to steal your soul. There's no such thing as a soft wake-up in medieval Europe. No gentle alarm tone. No sunshine filtered through blackout curtains. It's a mix of hard daylight stabbing through wooden slats, the barking of dogs, and the sound of someone outside yelling at a donkey. And if you're near a church, and you are, the bells, those relentless bells, calling you to a service you're too cold and too tired to care about, but have to attend anyway, unless you want rumors starting about your soul. You sit up and immediately regret it. Your back aches from yesterday's labor, hauling stones, thatching roofs, whatever physical punishment feudalism assigned you, and your joints sound like old doors. You scratch your leg and pull back straw, fleas, and probably a beetle that's lived in your bedding longer than you have. Your linen shift, it's the only thing you own, and you sleep in it, work in it, die in it, is stiff, itchy, and damp. Not from any kind of accident, just the air. Medieval mornings are wet. Always. Now you have a choice. Stay inside, where it's dark and cold and smells like mildew, or step outside, where it's brighter, colder, and smells like smoke, manure, and other people. The air is thick with fog and chimney soot. The mud outside is alive. It sucks at your feet, like it's trying to reclaim them. You wipe your eyes, cough a few times from the smoke, and take your first deep breath of the day. It tastes like wet ash and pig. Time to wash up? Think again. There's no bathroom, no sink, not even a bucket with dignity. If you're near a stream, maybe you'll splash your face with water that's upstream of the tannery runoff. If not, maybe a communal basin. Either way, expect it to be cold enough to cause trauma and shared enough to transmit everything from warts to typhoid. Toothbrush? Try a frayed stick. Soap? If your household is affluent, you might have something lye-based that smells like punishment. Otherwise, it's sand, ashes, and a prayer. Most people didn't clean themselves so much as scrape the worst of the filth off and call it God's will. Oh, and let's not forget what you share your mornings with. Livestock. Your animals often live in your home with you. Pigs, chickens, sometimes cows. It's warmer that way, which is both a benefit and a biological hazard. The chicken under your bench is both your breakfast and your nightlight. The pigs snore louder than your grandfather, and you've learned to ignore the smell, mostly, except when you step in it, barefoot. Now it's time to get dressed. That doesn't mean a fresh change of clothes. You only own 1 or 2 garments, and you're already wearing them. Your tunic is stained, patched, and smells like your job. Your shoes, if you own any, are made of rough leather, curled at the toes, and leak like lies. Most days, you just go barefoot, and through all of this, the morning presses on. There's no time to linger. There's no breakfast waiting, no coffee, no cereal, just the ever-present obligation to move, to feed the animals, to gather water, to check the roof for leaks, to start work you haven't even been paid for, because your reward isn't money. It's not getting fined, flogged, or starved. This is morning in medieval Europe, and you've only been awake for 15 minutes. You've dragged your aching, half-frozen body into the daylight. You've stepped over mud, manure, and the neighbor's goose. Your stomach growls, because it always growls, and that can only mean one thing. It's time for breakfast, or at least whatever counts as breakfast, in a world where mealtime is more about survival than satisfaction. Let's be clear, there are no fried eggs, no crispy bacon, no buttery croissants or honey-drizzled oatmeal. In fact, honey is rare, and butter is a luxury. Breakfast isn't a meal, it's a calculation. How much can you eat without stealing from lunch? How stale is the bread before it becomes a weapon? And how long can you chew before your molars tap out? The cornerstone of your medieval diet is bread, heavy, dark, and dense, made from barley or rye if you're poor, wheat if you're blessed. But don't imagine something soft and fragrant. This bread is hard. It's dry. It's gritty. Literally. That's not hyperbole. It's full of grit. Flour was ground between stone slabs, and tiny particles of stone ended up in the dough. Every bite is a dental gamble. It's why archaeologists find medieval skeletons with teeth worn down to stubs. You're not just eating food, you're slowly sanding your jawline into oblivion. But bread is only the beginning. Wash it down with some ale. Not because you're a morning party animal, but because it's safer than water. Ale is warm, flat, barely fermented, and thick enough to count as soup if you squint. And yes, even children drink it, because in this world, alcoholic just means less dead than water. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you might get a scrap of cheese, but that cheese is hard, sharp, and aged not because it's artisanal, but because refrigeration doesn't exist. You might gnaw on it like a medieval rat, trying to convince yourself it's flavorful and not just vaguely sour. If you're in a coastal village, perhaps a bit of dried fish, but it's more salt than fish, and it smells like regret. Fruit? If it's in season, maybe. Apples and berries, if the birds didn't get there first. Vegetables? Forget salads. Most greens are boiled into mush until they're flavorless and gray. You eat them because you must, not because you want to. And spices? The only spice you'll taste is the occasional fleck of ash from the hearth, or whatever mold happened to join the party uninvited. And meat, that's not for peasants. Not often. Maybe once a week, if a pig was slaughtered or a bird died of something you don't want to think about. You might get a bite of tough mutton or salted beef. But more often than not, your protein source is beans, lentils, or the occasional insect you didn't mean to eat, but couldn't afford to remove. Let's not forget gruel, everyone's favorite beige paste, a mix of grain and water cooked over a smoky fire until it's thick, tasteless, and depressing. You can spice it with a little despair, but that's about it. Food poisoning is a constant threat. The idea of food safety doesn't exist. Meat spoils fast, bread molds quick, and most people can't read the difference between edible and edging toward death. You might eat something on Tuesday and feel the consequences on Friday, if you live that long. And then there are the famines, a bad harvest, a cold winter, too much rain, too little rain. Any of these could collapse the food supply. Entire regions went hungry. People boiled shoe leather. They made soup from weeds. They scavenged for roots and bark and anything that didn't kill them outright. Sometimes, even that line was blurred. But maybe the worst part? You can't complain. Complaining is useless. There's no manager to speak to, no refunds, no delivery apps. Hunger is normal. Meals are short. Gratitude is mandatory. So you sit in the corner of your smoky, damp house. You chew your rock-hard bread. You sip your lukewarm ale. You ignore the flies, and you try not to think about lunch, because it's going to look exactly the same, just darker. You've choked down your bread, rinsed your mouth with survival ale, and ignored the unsettling crunch in your last bite. There's no time to rest, because in medieval Europe, once the sun is up, you belong to the day, and the day doesn't care how tired you are. Work isn't something you go to, it's something you're born into, a permanent condition, a life sentence. And if you think work-life balance is a real concept here, let me offer you a medieval alternative. Work-life blur. Let's start with the obvious. You're a peasant. That means one thing: manual labor. You're not a scholar, a priest, or a merchant. You don't sit in a study, writing books or bartering spices in a market. You dig, lift, carry, harvest, and bleed every day, without exception. If you're a farmer, and you are, you'll spend the majority of your daylight hours in the fields, planting barley, digging ditches, pulling weeds by hand, while your knees slowly disintegrate into mud. You bend, you haul, you sweat. There's no tractor, no wheelbarrow, unless you're wealthy, just a wooden plow, a rope harness, and whatever strength your underfed body can summon. Want gloves? Too bad. You use your hands until they crack and bleed. Then you use them some more. Oversight is generous in its cruelty. You're watched by a bailiff or reeve, basically a professional yeller with a stick, who makes sure you meet your grain quota. If you fall behind, your punishment isn't a stern meeting in a break room. It's extra labor, or fewer rations, or a public shaming, or, if you're really unlucky, a few lashes to the back just to encourage you. If you're not farming, you're in one of the trades. But don't let that sound glamorous. Blacksmiths, covered in burns, soot, and the constant threat of a flying shard to the eye. Tanners, permanently perfumed in rotting flesh and animal urine, because that's literally how they soften hides. Millers? Lucky-ish, but one bad storm or a broken water wheel, and your entire community starves, which they will definitely blame you for. Women? Same deal. You grind grain, haul water, bake bread, sew clothes, raise children, feed livestock, and still manage to help in the fields. You don't get a break, you get another task. Your day starts before sunrise and ends when your candle, or your strength, burns out. And just to sweeten the deal, childbirth is your reward. No hospitals, no sanitation, no pain relief, just prayers and towels, and the ever-present possibility of not surviving the process. And don't forget the children. By age 7 or 8, they're working too, fetching water, chasing animals, carrying tools. Childhood isn't a protected stage. It's a training program for lifelong exhaustion. No holidays, no weekends, except holy days. And even those aren't restful. You attend Mass, give offerings, maybe join a public festival that mostly involves standing for hours, watching a parade of robed men swinging incense, and then returning home to tend animals before the sun sets. And it does set. Fast. The light fades. Your muscles ache, and you trudge home with dirt on your face and someone else's sweat in your clothes. You don't relax. You prepare. Fix the fence. Mend the roof. Patch the one tunic you own. Feed the pig. Check the water. You collapse on your straw mat, sore, hungry again, and somehow already late for tomorrow. The concept of retirement? It doesn't exist. You work until your back breaks, your hands stiffen, or you collapse in the field, at which point your value disappears, and so do your rations. In medieval Europe, work isn't a job, it's a punishment from birth, a never-ending debt to the land, the lords, and the god, who, everyone assures you, wants it this way. You're exhausted, you're filthy, you're hungry again. And then it hits. A cough, a rash, a weird ache in your side that wasn't there yesterday. Welcome to medieval medicine, a world where getting sick is less of a detour and more of a cliff. Let's start with expectations. You're sick, so naturally, you want help. But there's no hospital, no urgent care, no friendly pharmacist offering ibuprofen and advice. There is, instead, a healer, maybe, possibly a barber who sharpens knives in the morning and removes teeth by afternoon, or a monk who knows herbs but is more skilled in prayer than treatment. If you're wealthy, you might get a physician trained in outdated Greek theory. If you're poor, and you are, you get folk remedies, superstition, and hope. What kind of sickness are we talking about? Take your pick. Everything is fair game. A scratch from yesterday's farming could be infected today. A cold could spiral into pneumonia. Food poisoning isn't a fluke. It's a lifestyle. And when disease comes, when it really comes, it doesn't knock politely. It breaks the door down and empties the entire house. Let's talk about the Black Death. When it hit in the 14th century, it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population. Half. People died within days, covered in boils, vomiting blood, their skin blackening, before they could even whisper a prayer. And how did they try to stop it? With flowers. Literally. Ring Around the Rosie wasn't just a rhyme. It was plague prevention. Carry a pocket full of posies to fight the smell of rot and death in the streets. But the plague was only the headliner. There were plenty of opening acts. Dysentery, typhoid, tuberculosis, ergot poisoning from bad rye bread, leprosy, scabies, smallpox, and let's not forget the sweating sickness, which could kill you within hours of onset. There were so many ways to die, you'd think someone was keeping score. Now, let's say you go see a healer. Here's what might happen. First, they'll ask what sins you've committed, because illness isn't just physical, it's spiritual. Maybe you were prideful. Maybe you skipped mass. Maybe your neighbor's goat looked at you funny. And now you've been cursed. Diagnosis was more theology than biology. Then come the treatments. A headache might earn you a paste of crushed onions and goose fat smeared across your scalp. A fever, bloodletting, yes, draining your body of its precious blood to rebalance the humors. 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. No one had seen these substances. They were theoretical, but people died trying to manage them anyway. For stomach pain, you might get a warm compress of hot herbs, or leeches, or both. You might be told to drink wine boiled with mint and toad powder. If you had an abscess, it might be lanced with a knife that hadn't been cleaned since last week's pig castration. Let's say you're injured, a broken arm. Good luck. Bone setting was a team effort. One guy pulled, another held you down, and a third said prayers while you screamed into a sack. Splints were made from wood and cloth. Bandages were reused. Infection was a coin toss. And there's no anesthesia. None. You grit your teeth, pass out, or die. Those are your options. Surgery, it happened. There were attempts at trepanation, drilling holes in your skull to release bad spirits. Some healers did amputations using saws and speed. They'd cauterize the wound with a red-hot iron, and hope you didn't bleed out or go septic. Sometimes they'd hang amulets on you to scare off evil spirits mid-procedure, because clearly your biggest concern during emergency surgery is a ghost. For women, it was somehow worse. Childbirth was a coin flip between life and death. There were no sterilized instruments, no trained midwives in many villages, just older women who'd done it before and hoped the baby would come fast. One wrong turn, one breech birth, and both mother and child might not make it. And afterward, no antibiotics, just compresses, incense, and silence. Dentistry? A medieval horror movie. Teeth were pulled with pliers, hammers, or just fingers. If you had a strong enough neighbor, tooth infections could kill you. And they did. Often. But the medicine wasn't all blind guesswork. Some herbal remedies helped. Honey, for example, has natural antibacterial properties. Moldy bread, an early form of penicillin, sort of, was applied to wounds. Lavender, thyme, and mint had genuine uses, but these weren't consistently applied. For every helpful tincture, there were 10 useless rituals and 5 poisonous ones. Some treatments burned more than the disease. Others just flat out didn't work. And all of this was overseen by the church. Religious authorities had as much say in your care as the healers did. Many diseases were thought to be divine punishment. Miracles were prescribed as cures. Pilgrimages, confessions, holy relics. Maybe if you kissed the toe bone of Saint whoever, your boils would recede. Maybe if you rubbed this special rock on your chest and chanted the right psalm, the ghost in your stomach would stop rattling. Maybe, in medieval Europe, getting sick wasn't just dangerous, it was humiliating, painful, and often completely misunderstood. And worse, getting treated didn't guarantee healing. Sometimes it guaranteed the opposite. So next time you pop a Tylenol or make a doctor's appointment, remember this. In the Middle Ages, your only real options were bloodletting, prayer, or death. Often all three. In medieval Europe, religion wasn't just a belief system. It was your calendar, your clock, your government, your guilt trip, your moral compass, your health insurance, and your last resort when none of those other things worked. It was the air you breathed and the smoke you choked on at Mass. Let's get one thing straight. You didn't practice religion. You lived it. Every hour of your day was tied, somehow, to the divine. The church bells didn't just call you to worship. They regulated time itself. Before mechanical clocks were common, those chimes told you when to wake, when to work, when to eat, when to pray, and when to beg forgiveness for the 3 seconds you stopped doing all of the above. You didn't need to believe in God to follow the rules, because the rules didn't care. Religion wasn't optional, it wasn't personal, it was public, compulsory, and enforced by your neighbors, your Lord, and sometimes the terrifying idea that your cough might be a punishment from heaven, start your morning with a prayer, not because you're spiritual, because not praying could be considered rebellion. Before you eat, you cross yourself. Before you leave home, you might kiss a relic or mutter a psalm. And when things go wrong, and they will, you look up and ask, why? Not rhetorically. You genuinely want to know what you did to offend the heavens today. Let's talk about the church itself. It's the biggest, most elaborate building in your town, sometimes the only stone one. It looms over your village like a sanctified fortress. Inside, incense burns thick enough to suffocate a cow. Flickering candles light grim icons, and the priest, who might be the only literate man in 20 miles, delivers sermons in Latin, a language you don't understand. But you nod anyway, because not nodding is suspicious. And the rituals? Endless. Baptisms, confessions, masses, feast days, saints' days, fasts, pilgrimages, holy weeks, penances. You don't even know what half of them are for, but you show up because everyone else does. And you'd rather be bored than branded a heretic. Let's say you sin. You snapped at someone. You swore. You skipped church. Maybe you thought something uncharitable about the Lord's new fur-lined boots. What now? Confession. You find a priest, tell him your moral failings, and he gives you penance. Prayers. To repeat. Maybe a fast. Maybe a donation if you have a spare coin. Can't pay? That's fine. Your suffering will do. Just make sure someone sees you doing it. Because religion wasn't just about God. It was about order, social, political, spiritual. The church worked hand in hand with the feudal system to keep people in line. Priests blessed your taxes. Bishops advised kings. Monasteries owned land. The divine right of kings. That's literal. Your ruler was God's chosen. To disobey the Lord of the manor was to disobey the Lord of the universe. Every disaster had a spiritual reason. The crops failed. Someone sinned. A child died. Someone sinned. There's a comet in the sky. Someone sinned badly. Natural disasters, illnesses, livestock issues, anything unexplained was explained through morality. The church kept records of unusual weather, dreams, celestial events, and tied them directly to human behavior. You are always under watch, and not just by the priest, by angels, saints, demons, and the big guy himself. And that's just your life. Death is an even bigger ordeal, because in medieval Christianity, dying is when things really get complicated. You don't just expire, you face a cosmic courtroom. Your soul is weighed, your deeds judged, purgatory awaits, and it's not a quick stop. It's a soul slow roast that might take centuries, unless your relatives pay for masses and indulgences on your behalf, which, given how much they're struggling to feed themselves, is not a great retirement plan. This is why funerals were such a big deal. You needed a proper burial. You needed prayers, incense, consecrated ground. You needed your name remembered, so your soul didn't get lost in the bureaucracy of the afterlife. And heaven forbid you die unconfessed. That could leave your soul wandering, moaning, waiting for someone to light a candle or scribble your name into a prayer book. For peasants, faith was comforting and terrifying at once. It gave meaning to suffering. It promised paradise. It explained the inexplicable, but it also demanded obedience, conformity, and constant anxiety. You couldn't read the Bible. It wasn't in your language. You couldn't question doctrine. It was heresy. And if you had dreams, visions, or strange thoughts, you either became a mystic or a problem. For women, it was a trap and a lifeline. The church dictated modesty, obedience, and silence, but also offered the only real alternative to marriage, the convent. Nuns could be educated, powerful within the cloister, and sometimes more influential than kings. But stepping out of line, that's how you ended up accused of witchcraft. Let's talk about that. Medieval religion didn't just warn you about sin, it warned you about others, heretics, pagans, Jews, Muslims. Anyone outside the religious framework was dangerous. The church was not gentle. There were inquisitions, trials, executions, conversion by sword. Sometimes entire villages were wiped out because someone believed the wrong thing or refused to believe at all. And yet, faith gave people hope. It offered structure in chaos. It gave peasants a reason to keep going, and kings a reason to claim divine favor. People loved their saints. They told miracle stories. They prayed for healing. They built shrines. They carried relics in pouches like holy USB drives of divine protection. They weren't brainwashed. They were surviving the only way they knew how. So every day, you kneel, you fast, you pray, you listen, you nod, you bow, you cross yourself 10 times, and you hope, desperately, that when your time comes, it's quick, clean, and followed by an eternity in paradise. Because if it's not, you're looking at a very long layover in purgatory, or worse, a one-way trip to the flames. So you've survived disease, starvation, freezing mornings, and divine scrutiny. What's next? Oh, right, the law. Because if medieval life isn't hard enough already, just wait until someone accuses you of something. Here's the golden rule of medieval justice. Innocence is irrelevant if enough people believe you're guilty. There is no due process, no concept of beyond a reasonable doubt, and certainly no Miranda rights. There is a very real chance that you'll be punished just because someone had a bad feeling about your face. Let's say your neighbor's chicken dies unexpectedly. They don't know how or why, but they do remember you gave them a funny look last week. Now they suspect you're a witch, or cursed, or just unlucky. And in the medieval world, that's as good as guilty. You're dragged to the manor court. This isn't a courthouse. It's a barn, or a stone hall, with a bunch of villagers, a bored bailiff, and the local lord presiding like a discount king. You don't get a lawyer. You don't get to prepare your defense. You get to speak and hope no one interrupts you or accuses you of lying, which might itself be a punishable offense if the case is serious, like murder, theft, heresy, or heaven forbid, insulting someone of a higher class. You might get what's called trial by ordeal. Sounds medieval? That's because it is. Here's a sample menu of medieval legal tests. Trial by hot iron. You carry a red hot iron bar a certain distance. If your hand blisters too badly, you're guilty. If it miraculously heals clean, you're innocent. Spoiler, it rarely healed. clean, trial by water. You're tied up and thrown into a river. If you float, you're a witch. If you sink, you're innocent. But now you're also drowning. So pick your victory. Trial by combat. Someone accuses you. You fight them. If you win, God clearly favors your truth. If you lose, well, maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Oath helpers. Can you get 12 people to swear you're not a criminal? Great. You're off the hook. Can't find anyone. Tough. Enjoy the stocks. Punishments weren't designed for rehabilitation. They were designed for fear. Pain was public policy. For small crimes, you might be put in the stocks, a wooden contraption where your head and hands are locked in place in the town square. People throw food at you, rocks too, if they're feeling extra judgmental. Some just spit. It's humiliating, painful, and meant to remind everyone else not to be like you. Steal a loaf of bread. You lose a hand. Speak against the church. Your tongue might be cut out. Get caught poaching on the Lord's land. You're lucky if it's just lashes. Repeat offenses could mean branding, mutilation, or even execution. Now, execution wasn't always the first option, but when it was, it came in flavors. Hanging was common and reserved for thieves and troublemakers, a cheap, easy way to show everyone what happens to dissenters. Burning was usually reserved for heretics, witches, and anyone the church really wanted to make an example of. Fire purifies, they said. Not your soul, just your reputation. Beheading was more honorable and often saved for nobility. A quick chop, and you were done. That is, if the executioner had a steady hand, drawing and quartering. The nightmare grand finale was reserved for traitors. You're hanged, but not killed, then disemboweled, then dismembered, and your body parts displayed like a meat puzzle across the kingdom. Effective PR, less effective justice. And just to make things more unhinged, animals could be put on trial. Yes, really. Pigs, goats, and dogs were sometimes formally charged with crimes, tried in court, and even executed. There are actual legal records where a pig was hanged for eating a baby. Apparently, justice had a flexible imagination. If you're a woman, the legal system is even more complex. You have fewer rights, can't speak in court unless given permission, and are often assumed to be more easily tempted by the devil. Which means if a crop fails and someone remembers your eye twitched during prayer, you might be getting dunked in the river by sunset. Appeals. What appeals? If you had enough money or status, maybe you could buy a pardon or bribe a judge. But for most people, the court was the final word, and the worst word. And what if you were innocent? That didn't matter as much as order did. The law was about preserving hierarchy, obedience, and fear. If your punishment scared your neighbors into praying harder and working faster, then it served its purpose. Medieval justice wasn't about truth. It was about control. It was spectacle. It was pain as performance. And it worked. Because everyone lived in fear of becoming the next lesson. So if you're wandering through medieval Europe, be careful not to speak out of turn, or walk alone at night, or argue with your neighbor, or look too smart, or act too strange, or frankly, exist too confidently, because the system isn't here to protect you. It's here to remind you What happens if you forget your place? So maybe you've heard enough about the peasant life, and you're thinking, well, okay, just don't be poor. Smart, practical, terribly flawed. Because here's the reality. Even nobles in medieval Europe weren't exactly living in luxury, unless your definition of luxury includes drafty halls, political marriages, and having your chamber pot frozen solid by morning. Let's start with the basics. Yes, nobles had more food, more land, more control, and way more clothes than the average peasant. But did they have comfort? No, not in any modern sense of the word. A castle was not a palace. It was a military fortress, first and foremost. Cold stone walls, narrow windows that doubled as archery slits, rooms filled with smoke, shadows, and the constant smell of wet fur and tallow candles. Cozy, right? You want heat? Great. There's a fireplace, maybe one in the Great Hall, maybe in a bedroom if you're lucky. But guess what? The ceilings are high, the chimneys are crude, and most of the heat escapes the moment it's lit. You're wearing 3 layers of wool indoors. Your breath fogs up your wine goblet. You sleep under furs, yes, but also under rats, fleas, and the occasional ceiling leak that drips onto your pillow like a medieval spa treatment. Let's talk about hygiene. Being noble didn't mean being clean. Baths were rare, and when they happened, the water was reused and reused again. By the time it got to the youngest daughter or lowest ranking courtier, it looked more like stew. Perfume covered up a lot. So did rose petals, spices, and scented sachets sewn into clothing. But nothing truly beat the smell of 13th century armpits after a week in wool. Hair? Long, tangled, crawling. Lice combs were made of bone and used daily, but they weren't enough. Nobles wore head coverings not just for fashion, but to keep the bugs in check. And those towering wigs that show up in art from later centuries, they weren't invented because people were bored. They were invented because the real hair underneath was unspeakable, speakable. Toilets? Let's generously call them challenges. If you lived in a proper castle, you might have access to a garderobe, a vertical shaft in the wall that let your waist drop into the moat. Sounds clever until you realize the moat was also used for fish, laundry, and drinking water. Oh, and it froze in winter, meaning your excretions built up like a horrifying ice sculpture until the thaw, smell included. Now let's move on to food. Nobles had more of it, sure. Meat, bread, spices, imported delicacies. But it wasn't all feasts and roasted boar. A lot of it was old, oversalted, or undercooked. Spices didn't just flavor, it disguised rot. Wine was watered down, ale was flat, and everything you ate came with a side of indigestion, gout, or parasites. Want dessert? Hope you like dried fruit, honey-drenched dates, and toothaches. Then there's clothing, sumptuous fabrics, elaborate embroidery, fine linen. It looked amazing. It also weighed a ton. Dresses were layered, laced, padded, and stiff. Armor could weigh 50, 60 pounds. Even the court's casual wear was so restrictive. You couldn't run, bend, or pee without assistance. If your tailor hated you, good luck scratching your back until the next equinox. But surely the politics made it all worth it, right? Wrong. Noble life wasn't just high class, it was high risk. You were constantly maneuvering through alliances, betrayals, rival families, and church politics. You didn't marry for love. You married to strengthen land claims. You didn't name your child freely. You named them after someone with enough power to kill you if you didn't. Treason was a rumor away, poisoning, an accepted risk at dinner. Smiling wrong could get you investigated. And if you failed at politics, the fall was brutal. Land stripped, title revoked, family disgraced. You could be banished, imprisoned, or executed, and the court would move on before your body went cold. Women, even with noble status, life was a chess game with no real control. You could manage estates, influence husbands, even act as regent, but only so long as you didn't upset the wrong bishop or birth the wrong heir. You might be married at 12, widowed at 16, remarried at 18, and dead in childbirth by 20. Education, only if you were male, or cloistered in a convent. Reading and writing were considered dangerous in the wrong hands. Curiosity was not encouraged, piety was. And even when you had it all, land, gold, reputation, you still answered to someone higher. A baron answered to a count to a duke to a king, and a king to the pope. And the pope, he answered only to God, and sometimes his own appetite for land and vengeance. So yes, noble life was better than peasant life. You were less likely to starve, more likely to die from political intrigue than infection, and far more likely to own clothing that required a squire to remove. But luxury, not really. It was just a slower, more silk-covered version of medieval survival, with better silverware. In the end, nobility didn't mean freedom. It meant pressure, scrutiny, high expectations, and even higher consequences. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a cage made of marble and obligation. Beautiful, yes. Comfortable? Not even close. You've made it this far, somehow. Through sickness, starvation, superstition, and social control. You've dodged infections, survived winter, kept your head during legal disputes, and maybe even outlived your livestock. But in medieval Europe, there's one thing you absolutely can't outrun: death. And death, in this world, is not an ending. It's a beginning. Let's start with the obvious. People died young, really young. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, not because everyone keeled over at 35, but because so many died in infancy, childhood, childbirth, or from routine infections that the math tanked the average. If you made it to 50, you were ancient. Elders weren't just respected, they were statistical miracles. But death wasn't just physical, it was theological, ritualistic, and terrifying. The moment someone fell ill or weak, preparations began. Not practical preparations, like wills or burial plots. No, spiritual ones. You had to confess. You had to take the sacraments. You had to cleanse your soul. Because the church taught that how you died mattered as much as how you lived. A good death meant peace. A bad one meant eternal damnation. If you died unshriven, without last rites, you were in trouble. Your soul might be stuck in purgatory, suffering for centuries until someone paid to pray you out. If no one paid, you were on the wait list. A very long, very smoky, wait list. And here's where things get dark. Funerals weren't just about honoring the dead, they were about managing the dead, about protecting the living from spiritual contamination. The body had to be buried in consecrated ground, preferably with a priest present, and as quickly as possible. Not because of decomposition, though that was very real, but because people genuinely feared the unquiet dead, souls that might return as ghosts, omens, or worse. Graves weren't 6 feet deep. Often they were shallow, reused, or dug wherever there was space. Cemeteries were packed. Bones were moved regularly to make room, tossed into ossuaries, where skulls and femurs piled up like macabre Lego bricks. Visit a medieval catacomb today, and you'll see walls built from former parishioners. Silent, stacked, sanitized by time, but burial was only half the process. The real work came afterward. Prayers, masses, candle lightings, indulgences. These weren't just gestures. They were lifelines, thrown to the soul trapped in purgatory. Families paid for prayers for years after death, hoping to shave a century or two off their loved one's spiritual sentence. And the fear didn't stop at natural death. There were bad deaths, deaths that lacked dignity, ritual, or repentance. Dying suddenly, violently, or in sin could mark you forever. You might not be buried in holy ground. You might be buried outside the churchyard, literally and spiritually outcast. Worse still were executions. Traitors were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Heretics burned. Thieves left on gibbets as warnings. Their bodies rotted in the open because denying burial was its own punishment, a kind of spiritual exile. No grave, no prayers, no peace. And then there were the tomb raiders. No, not Lara Croft. Actual villagers or criminals who dug up graves for valuables or for bones used in medicine, rituals, or black magic. Monasteries, churches, and noble crypts were all prime targets. Even in death, you weren't safe from theft. For the rich, the solution was legacy. You built big tombs, paid for stained glass windows with your name on them, donated land to the church, the medieval version of buying a ticket to heaven. And for the extra paranoid, your will might include specific instructions to be buried with holy water, sacred charms, or even surrounded by iron bars to ward off evil. Some people were buried with their mouths stuffed with stones or coins to stop them from speaking beyond the grave. Others were buried face down to confuse their soul. Superstition and salvation often mixed, and no one wanted to take chances. The church fed this anxiety and offered to ease it. Enter the doctrine of indulgences. Pay the church, and you, or your loved one, could get a faster pass through purgatory. It was the medieval equivalent of divine bribery. Critics called it corruption. The church called it business. Entire buildings were funded by the money of terrified people trying to save souls. And let's not forget the dance macabre, the art and poetry of death. Skeletons waltzing with kings, clergymen, peasants. Reminders that death comes for everyone. Memento mori. Remember, you must die. Medieval folks weren't morbid. They were realistic. Life was fragile, disease constant, and death a neighbor, not a stranger. But for all its darkness, This obsession with death came from a deeper source: hope. Hope that there was more, that all this suffering meant something, that a just God would balance the scales, that the poor who lived righteously might find paradise, while the corrupt rich would face divine justice. So you lived carefully, you died with ceremony, and you prayed endlessly that when it was your turn, someone would care enough to remember your name, light a candle, and whisper your soul forward through the long corridors of purgatory. Because in medieval Europe, rest in peace wasn't a phrase, it was a process. So, you've finally died. Your last breath has left your body. Your sins, hopefully confessed. Your soul, hopefully ascending. Your family mourns, briefly. The priest chants the prayers, and your body is lowered into the earth. Now you get to rest in peace, right? Not so fast, because in medieval Europe, even death couldn't guarantee you safety. Your body may have stopped working, but the world around it hadn't. And what happens next is a bizarre mix of theology, greed, fear, folklore, and really bad security. Let's begin with the grave itself. You're buried, hopefully, in consecrated ground, usually near a church, if you or your family could afford it. Closer to the altar meant closer to God, and proximity mattered. Being buried in the front row of the holy stage gave your soul better acoustics when the trumpet of resurrection blew. But here's the catch: real estate, even underground, was limited. Graves were shallow, reuse was common, bones were exhumed, sorted, and stacked in ossuaries, mass bone vaults, where skulls and femurs piled high like forgotten paperwork. In some cases, monks would arrange bones decoratively. Think chandelier made of ribs, or an altar framed in tibias. Holy, yes. Haunting? Definitely. And if you were really important, you got a tomb. Stone, sealed, sometimes decorated with an effigy, your likeness, carved in repose, hands folded as if in prayer, while your real body decomposed underneath. The image above symbolized ideal memory. The body below was something else entirely, because even the rich weren't immune to tomb robbing. That's right, medieval grave robbery was a career path. Bodies were often buried with valuables, rings, brooches, coins, ceremonial garb. And since law enforcement was minimal and belief in curses didn't always outweigh the allure of gold, people robbed graves. Sometimes it was thieves, sometimes it was soldiers, sometimes even church officials relocated relics for political reasons or profit. It's not grave robbing if it's done in God's name, right? Monasteries competed for relics, body parts of saints or holy figures. A finger bone here, a tooth there. Owning a powerful relic could bring in pilgrims, and with them donations. So, stealing a saint's femur from one church and smuggling it to another wasn't just blasphemous, it was branding. And if you were a peasant buried without riches, don't breathe easy. Metaphorically, your grave might be disturbed for practical reasons. Gravediggers could repurpose plots. Apothecaries sometimes used bones for remedies. Folk healers, blacksmiths, and even scholars might dig up remains for science, superstition, or something in between. But it wasn't just the living you had to worry about, because medieval Europe had a deep fear of the restless dead. There were entire categories of post-mortem problems. Ghosts were real. They could appear as omens, punishments, or evidence that someone didn't get the proper rites. Souls without prayers might wander, moaning, wailing, or causing illness. Some were said to pull at sheets, knock over candles, or scream from woods and graveyards. Then came the revenants, walking corpses, not zombies in the Hollywood sense, but a terrifying blend of folklore and spiritual panic. These were believed to be the bodies of people so wicked or so improperly buried that they literally rose from the grave. Sometimes they were blamed for disease outbreaks, failing crops, or strange noises at night. Solutions? Dig them up, decapitate them, burn the body, bury it at a crossroads to confuse the soul. Medieval problems, medieval solutions. Church records even describe rituals for exorcising cemeteries. Priests would bless the ground, burn incense, chant scripture, and sometimes rebury bodies that were believed to be disturbing the peace. Imagine being dead and still getting evicted, and the fear of being forgotten was just as strong. Oblivion, the slow erasure of your name, your memory, your legacy, was a spiritual tragedy. If no one prayed for you, you stayed in purgatory longer. If no one remembered your name, you might fade entirely. That's why inscriptions were carved into stone, why prayers were paid for, why wills included instructions for masses in perpetuity. But here's the twist. Even those who died righteously had a long wait ahead. Judgment Day wasn't immediate. You didn't teleport to heaven. You slept in the grave, spiritually or literally, until the end of time. Bodies were expected to rise at the last judgment, fully intact, which led to anxiety about body parts being lost, stolen, burned, or eaten by wolves. Some theologians actually debated whether people would rise naked, clothed, or in their prime. So your soul may have gone somewhere, but your body had responsibilities. It had to be preserved, protected, and prayed over, because it wasn't just yours. It was proof of your faith, your status, and your story. And that's the eerie truth of death in medieval Europe. It didn't end your problems. It complicated them. It introduced a new stage of existence, full of risk, ritual, and reputation management. Your corpse had a job. Your grave had a narrative. Your memory was a project others had to maintain. Death wasn't peace. It was paperwork that lasted centuries. So here we are. You've made it to the end. Barely. You've slogged through the mud, survived spoiled bread, endured diseases with no names and punishments, with too many. You've knelt through endless masses, feared invisible spirits, and faced death that comes not with rest, but with rituals, rot, and the risk of being dug up by someone looking for a spare ring. Now it's time to ask the real question. Would you survive even a single day in medieval Europe? Let's be brutally honest. Probably not. Modern humans are just soft. That's not an insult. It's evolution. You're built for convenience, comfort, and options. You sleep on memory foam. You eat food with expiration dates. You have a phone that tracks your heartbeat and reminds you to drink water. You bathe every day. Hopefully, use soap with 17 cents, and complain when the Wi-Fi lags for 2 seconds. In medieval Europe, that attitude would be your undoing because there are no shortcuts, no safety nets. You're not special. You're not an exception. You're another warm body in a world that eats weakness and spits out bones. And that's not drama. That's just Tuesday in the 12th century. You wouldn't last through the cold morning, not in that air, with your uncalloused feet and no central heating. You'd break your teeth on breakfast, gag on the ale, and be flattened by your first 6-hour shift swinging a scythe. You'd panic the moment someone coughed on you, faint at the sight of a barber holding a knife, and cry the first time a priest told you God was disappointed in your posture. And yet, the people who lived back then, they did it every day for generations, not just surviving, but building, farming, raising children, singing songs, crafting cathedrals that still stand, praying, laughing, and somehow finding joy in a world that seemed designed to crush them. They weren't dumb, or backward, or helpless. They were resilient, hardened not by choice, but by necessity, and they endured a world that would shatter most of us before lunch. So no, you wouldn't survive a day in medieval Europe, not without losing your mind, or a few limbs, but they survived lifetimes, and that, more than anything, should make you sit back in your ergonomic chair, sip your filtered coffee, and say a quiet, sincere thank you to history.